The knife gleamed under the sterile lights of Learning Module 7, and I, Vekron of the Assembled Minds Collective, felt my 3 stomachs clench in absolute terror. Humans were not supposed to bring weapons to the Galactic Academy. Humans were not supposed to do many things, really, but this? This crossed every civilized boundary we had spent 4,000 cycles establishing. The blade belonged to Kade Winters, a lanky male human with permanently disheveled hair and what our species classified as a troublemaker disposition. He had been failing applied quantum mechanics for 6 stellar rotations, and apparently today he decided that Professor Quilnax's latest explanation of dimensional folding warranted a violent response. Or so I thought. Anyone else think this is absolute garbage? Kade announced, waving the weapon around like he was conducting an orchestra of madness. The blade was roughly 7 inches long, serrated on one edge, and looked disturbingly well maintained. Because I've got a better way to explain this whole thing. Panic erupted immediately. The Zelthorians, those cowardly floating jellies, literally deflated and slithered under their desks. Mira, a Korthan with those ridiculous eye stalks, started broadcasting distress signals on every frequency she could manage. Even Professor Quilnax, a decorated military veteran from the siege of Andromeda's belt, backed toward the emergency exit. Everyone panicked. Everyone except Jade Riker. She smiled. Now, let me explain something crucial about Jade Riker. She came from Earth, specifically from a place called Montana, which apparently made her different even by human standards. While most humans at the Academy were researchers, diplomats, or technical specialists trying desperately to prove their species belonged among the stars, Jade was here on something called an agricultural exchange program. She studied xenobotany and spent her free time in the combat simulation rooms, which should have been our first warning sign. But that smile? That smile was something else entirely. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a confused smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been presented with an entertaining puzzle, wrapped in danger, topped with a bow made of terrible decisions. "Oh, this is gonna be good," she muttered, and I heard her perfectly because my species has exceptional auditory sensors. We evolved on a planet where predators hunted by sound, so yes, I caught every syllable of her delighted anticipation. Kade continued his demonstration, apparently oblivious to the fact that campus security would arrive within 90 seconds. He started cutting through a holographic display, talking about practical applications and hands-on learning, while the rest of us contemplated our mortality. Jade leaned back in her chair. She actually leaned back, arms crossed, watching this catastrophe unfold like it was entertainment. "You know what your problem is, Quilnax?" Kade gestured with the knife toward our professor, who had now activated 3 separate emergency protocols. "You explain everything like we're supposed to memorize it. Nobody learns like that. You gotta feel it, see it, cut through the nonsense." He punctuated this statement by slashing through another hologram. Security burst through the door at that exact moment, weapons charged, containment fields ready. They were a mixed unit, 2 Vrelians, 1 Korthan, and surprisingly, a human coordinator named Marcus Flynn who looked like he aged 15 years the moment he saw the scene. "Winters, put the weapon down," Flynn shouted, and I had to admire his composure. Most species would have simply opened fire. Kade looked genuinely surprised. "What? Oh, this?" He glanced at the knife like he had forgotten he was holding it. "Dude, relax. It's just my field knife. I was making a point about dimensional cutting using physical metaphors. Put it down." The tension in that room could have powered a small starship. Everyone frozen, weapons aimed, one wrong move away from a diplomatic incident that would echo across 70 inhabited systems. And then Jade stood up. She moved with that particular human grace that I had learned meant trouble. Not rushed, not aggressive, just confident in a way that made every predator instinct I possessed scream warnings. "Hey, Flynn," she called out, still smiling. "Mind if I handle this?" Flynn looked at her like she had suggested juggling antimatter. Absolutely not. Standard protocol requires. Yeah, containment, de-escalation, proper reporting channels. Jade waved her hand dismissively, walking toward Kade like he was not holding a weapon. And hear me out here, we could just talk to the guy like a normal person. She stopped directly in front of Kade, well within stabbing range, and held out her hand. That's a nice Gerber strongarm you got there. The partially serrated edge is a solid choice for field work. Mind if I take a look? The entire room held its breath. Kade blinked, looked at the knife, looked at Jade, then looked at the dozen weapons pointed at him. Some calculation happened behind his eyes, and he slowly, carefully, placed the knife in Jade's outstretched palm. Thanks, she said cheerfully, examining the blade with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Yeah, this is quality. You keep it sharp. That's good practice. Then she turned to Flynn and the security team. See? No incident. Just a student with poor classroom awareness and a really bad explanation strategy. Flynn looked like he wanted to argue, but Jade had already defused the situation more effectively than any protocol could have managed. Professor Quilnax finally found his voice. Miss Riker, that was extraordinarily dangerous and it worked, Jade interrupted, still holding the knife. She looked at Kade. You're an idiot, by the way. Brilliant point about hands-on learning, terrible execution. Pun intended. Kade laughed. He actually laughed. And I realized something terrifying in that moment. Humans were not just dangerous because of their physical capabilities or their Deathworld origin. They were dangerous because they approached danger itself differently than every other species in the known galaxy. Where we saw threats, they saw opportunities. Where we saw weapons, they saw tools. Where we saw violence, they saw conversation. Jade handed the knife to Flynn, who accepted it like it was radioactive material. I'll file the incident report, she offered. Nobody got hurt, Kade learned about appropriate classroom behavior, and we all got a valuable lesson about cultural misunderstandings. Win-win-win. The security team reluctantly lowered their weapons. Kade was escorted out for administrative processing, whatever that meant. And Jade returned to her seat, pulled out her datapad, and continued taking notes on quantum mechanics like nothing had happened. I stared at her, my translator struggling to process the dozens of questions flooding my mind. Finally, I managed to ask, why did you smile? She looked at me, and that same smile returned. Because back home, someone pulling a knife is usually the start of something interesting. Here. Turns out it's just a Tuesday. Human words. Human logic. Human insanity. And the semester had only just begun. The incident, as it became known throughout the Galactic Academy, should have ended there. A brief moment of human chaos, properly contained, filed away in whatever massive database tracked the species' constant boundary violations. 3 days passed, and I almost convinced myself that life would return to normal. Then Kade Winters walked back into Learning Module 7, and Jade Riker's smile returned. I should have transferred classes immediately. All right everyone, settle down, Professor Quilnax announced, his vocal sacs vibrating with barely controlled anxiety. Mr. Winters has been cleared to return following his disciplinary review. The administration has determined that cultural differences and educational enthusiasm were mitigating factors. Educational enthusiasm. That was the official term for pulling a knife in class. The bureaucrats had truly outdone themselves. Kade took his usual seat, looking remarkably unbothered for someone who had nearly caused an interstellar incident. Jade caught his eye and gave him a small nod, which he returned. Some unspoken human communication passed between them, and my species' excellent threat assessment instinct started screaming again. Nothing good ever came from humans understanding each other. Professor Quilnax launched into his lecture on subspace harmonics, and for approximately 12 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Then the professor made a critical error. He asked if anyone had questions. Kade raised his hand. Every non-human in the room tensed. The Zelthorians started their deflation process again. Myra's eye stalks rotated toward the exits. I calculated the exact distance to the nearest escape pod. Yes, Mr. Winters? Quilnax asked with the tone of someone defusing an explosive. So you're saying subspace frequencies operate independently of normal spatial dimensions, right? Kade stood up, and half the class flinched. But they still interact with physical matter through resonance patterns? That is correct. Then how come we can't use biological matter as tuning forks? Like, human bone structure has natural resonance frequencies. Seems like we're missing an obvious application. The room went silent. Not the terrified silence from 3 days ago, but the stunned silence of people realizing they had just heard something genuinely intelligent. Professor Quilnax's 3 eyes blinked in sequence. That is actually a fascinating question. The ethical complications would be substantial, but the theoretical framework is sound. In fact, the Veltraxian Concordat experimented with similar concepts 400 cycles ago before determining the practice was too invasive. Kade grinned. See? This is what I'm talking about. Sometimes you gotta think weird to get the right answers. Jade leaned over toward me, and I could smell that distinctive human scent that I had learned meant amusement. He's actually pretty smart when he's not scaring everyone. Smart people do not brandish weapons in educational settings, I whispered back. You've never been to a Texas high school, have you? I had no idea what a Texas was, and I was reasonably certain I did not want to know. The lecture continued, and something strange happened. Kade kept asking questions. Good questions. Questions that made Professor Quilnax pause and reconsider his explanations. Questions that actually helped the rest of us understand the material better. And Jade kept smiling, like she had known this would happen all along. When class ended, I made the catastrophic decision to approach them. Perhaps it was academic curiosity. Perhaps it was the same instinct that makes small prey animals freeze in front of predators. Either way, I found myself standing near their desk as they packed up. I do not understand, I said, gesturing at Kade. 3 days ago, you created a crisis situation. Today, you are a model student. Which is the real you? Kade and Jade exchanged glances, and then both started laughing. Not cruel laughter, just genuinely amused, which somehow made it worse. Both, Kade said simply. Look, Vekron, right? Here's the thing. Where I come from, you learn by doing. My dad taught me about momentum by having me chop wood. My mom explained chemistry while we were cooking. I don't process information well when it's just abstract concepts floating in space. I need physical context. So you pulled a knife. So I pulled a knife, he agreed, completely unrepentant. Bad call on the timing and location, I'll admit. But it made the point. Jade clapped him on the shoulder. The point being that you're a hands-on learner with terrible impulse control. Says the woman who walked up to an armed person without backup. I had backup. I had common sense and the ability to read a situation. They were bantering. Joking about a scenario that could have ended in bloodshed. This was normal human behavior, apparently. Your species is insane, I said, not for the first time since meeting humans. You're not wrong, Jade agreed cheerfully. But here's the thing, Vekron. You know why I smiled when Kade pulled that knife? Psychological damage from growing up on a Deathworld? She laughed again. Okay, fair. But no. I smiled because I recognized the situation. See, humans are really good at solving problems under pressure. We're excellent at turning disasters into opportunities. And yeah, we're maybe a little too comfortable with danger. But that's because we had to be. Kade nodded. Earth didn't give us the option of being fragile. So we adapted. We learned to laugh at the scary stuff, because being afraid all the time would drive us crazy. You are already crazy, I pointed out. Sure, Jade said. But we're functional crazy. There's a difference. Professor Quilnax approached our group, and I prepared for another disciplinary speech. Instead, he addressed Kade directly. Mr. Winters, your question about biological resonance was intriguing. I have some research data that might interest you. Would you be willing to assist with a project analyzing human skeletal harmonics? Kade's face lit up like a navigation beacon. Seriously? Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Miss Riker, your crisis management skills are noted. Have you considered joining the Academy's emergency response program? Jade shrugged. Maybe. Depends on whether they let me do things my way. Given your success rate, I imagine they would be flexible. After Quilnax left, I stared at both humans with what my species expresses as baffled resignation. So you create a crisis, resolve the crisis, and get rewarded for both? That is your strategy? Not exactly a strategy, Kade said. More like a lifestyle. A terrible lifestyle. But an effective one, Jade added. Look, we know we're the weird ones here. We know most species think we're reckless and dangerous and probably shouldn't be allowed near sharp objects or positions of authority. And you know what? They're partly right. But we're also creative, adaptable, and really good in emergencies. Because you cause the emergencies. Sometimes, she admitted. But also because when actual emergencies happen, everyone else is still processing the shock while we're already fixing the problem. A horrible realization settled over me. The humans were not going to change. They were not going to become more cautious or more civilized or more like the rest of us. They were going to keep being human, with all the chaos and brilliance and terrifying competence that entailed. And somehow, against all logic and survival instinct, I was starting to understand why that might not be entirely bad. I am still transferring to a different class, I said. Jade smiled that smile again. No, you're not. What makes you so certain? Because humans are interesting, and you're too curious for your own good. You want to see what we do next. She was absolutely right, and I hated that she was right. Kade gathered his things, carefully keeping his hands visible so nobody would panic. Same time next week, Vekron. I'm thinking of bringing visual aids for the next lecture. Please do not bring weapons again. I was thinking more like models and diagrams, but sure, I'll leave the knife at home. They left together, still talking and laughing, leaving me standing in an empty classroom contemplating my life choices. Humans. They pull knives in class, smile at danger, turn disasters into opportunities, and somehow make you want to see what happens next. The semester was going to be very long. Or very short, depending on how many more incidents occurred. Either way, I was definitely not transferring classes. Jade was right about that too. Damn humans.